I am going to turn the transcript off though, because that is a major distraction for me. Okay, transcription stopped, recording on. All right, we are off to the races. Let me go ahead and share my other screen. And I don't have my normal camera set up, so I'm looking away because I'm looking at my other screen. And I'm flying solo today, and so I'm trying to keep an eye on who's coming into the meeting and the chat. So I would say because of that, it's not as easy for me to see the chat when I don't have a colleague in the meeting with me. So if you have a question, especially since we're a small group, just raise your hand. And if for some reason I don't see you, just come off mute and pause me because I think we'll have plenty of time to get through our full agenda today. So off we go. Lovely to have everybody here. We are going to kick off our final community of practice session of the year. And I tried to make the session agenda as relevant as possible to all of the suggestions or the requests that those of you who responded to that survey, the suggestions that you made for the kinds of things we can talk about, and then we can just, have an open Q&A. So there are a few things that are relevant because there's 2 announcements that are just getting launched today, which I will talk to you about as well. And then we'll just go through the Q&A that you shared and any other additional questions that you might have. And from there, we'll just see how far we get. And we may very well be able to wrap up a little bit early. So we'll see if we can give you back some of your day or your evening, depending on where you're at. So we're going to just have a quick overview of the steps at registration in the context of the project cycle, since many of you are aiming for that, and just wanting to make sure that everybody does understand what those individual steps are and what's the expectation for what gets submitted at registration and for validation. And then I'm going to talk us through new requirements for Nature Framework VVBs, which were just published today, actually about 10 minutes ago, so we were trying to do it in time for this meeting. And that will help you to understand more of the sort of comprehensive validation and verification process, all the way from registration and the scope of both technical expert assessment, which I'll talk about, as well as the auditing evaluation or assessment as well. And then we'll just go through the Q&A, as I said. So let's go ahead and remind ourselves that we're here just to discuss, collaborate, share experiences, ask questions, and we always want to keep the space open, honest, judgment-free, and confidential, please. So now let's talk through the steps at registration. And what I've done here is I've just brought in a couple of screenshots from the Nature Framework project cycle, which is detailed in the Nature Framework. And it's in section 2.3 at the very beginning on page 13. And this is just the steps of the project cycle through validation. And so you'll see with the color coding, those individual steps in sort of this light blue would be each of you as the project proponent. That sort of light yellow is Vera. Green is the technical expert panel, which I will talk to you about just now. And then we've got the VVB, the validation verification body, and then the actual steps along the way, the milestones. So at registration, this is primarily what we're looking at first. So you'll be submitting your project description, your PD, and any other supporting documents, and that will go to the registry for project listing. If you don't already have a registry account, I would suggest going ahead and getting that set up, in advance. It's just another step in the process that takes a little bit of time. And so it's something that you can certainly do now. It doesn't require you to submit any other project documentation with it. And so once all of your documentation comes in, for project listing, then there will be sort of 2 review elements. And those of you who are already VCS projects, this will be familiar to you, but some of you are not. So I just want to make sure that everybody has an understanding. So Vera will perform what we call a completeness review. And actually that is going to be me. And I'll remind you all that from April 1st, when the Nature Framework is then open for use, my hat will change slightly. And then I will become sort of nature framework review, more on the project management and operations side. And I will still be leading a piloting process, or I will be leading an engagement process, but all of you will no longer be pilots. And the pilot process itself will essentially come to an end in the way in which we've experienced it up until this point. So then I become a reviewer, and we can talk a bit in the Q&A about what that means for the kind of feedback that I can give you, any of you, after April 1st, regardless of when you intend actually to submit your documentation. But the completeness review just means, has everything been answered? Are all of the appropriate documents there? Is your project description and your entire, sort of submission package, is that complete? And then at the same time that that's happening, we're going to have this technical expert panel evaluating some of the key technical elements of your project design. And in the next slide, we'll look at the scope of that in a little bit more detail, but things like your condition indicators, your reference values, your crediting baseline, your sampling protocol and monitoring plan. And that's going to be happening in real time alongside my review for overall completeness of your project design. And what will happen is the comments coming back from those technical experts, there will be 2 per project, will be provided back to you, and you'll have an opportunity to make changes or adjustments to respond to those comments before your project goes out for public comment and before it is handed over to the VVB for validation. And this is going to serve 2 purposes, which again, we'll talk about in the next slide, but it's the timing of that is to give you as project proponents an opportunity to respond and make those changes, especially in this first wave of registration. Before the project is posted on the registry for with all of your documentation for public comment. And of course, before it actually goes to the VVB for auditing at validation. And we're hoping that this is going to be an opportunity, to make those changes or adjustments at a critical moment so that you're able to have a smoother transition into the validation steps. And so from there, after the 30-day public comment period, the project is officially listed. And then you're going to be submitting your description, your project description, all of your project documentation to the actual validation and verification body, to the VVB. And then that VVB will move forward with validation auditing. So assessing your project documentation, your project design for compliance with the SD Vista program rules, as well as the Nature Framework rules. And they will provide a validation report or documentation. And there's a process there to respond to the elements of those findings as well at validation. And then Vera, in the end, reviews the completed validation request, and then your project is essentially validated and live. And so before I pause for questions about the overall registration process, I just wanted to talk through this Nature Framework Technical Expert Panel. And this announcement is also being published today as well. And so I'll be able to share these links with everybody in an email, which I'll summarize everything we've talked about today and some other key bits and pieces, and I'll get that sent out probably before the end of the week. But this technical expert panel is really intended to, make sure that Nature Framework projects have, ecosystem appropriate design, that it's intended to help promote confidence and integrity in the biodiversity outcomes that your projects will generate. And then just also overall to support the framework's operationalization and its ongoing development. And so the terms of reference for this technical expert panel, or TEP, as I said, will be published today. But I just wanted to give you a clearer idea of the scope of these experts' evaluation of your projects. And so there will be 2 independent experts. They will be ecosystem experts, and you'll be able to see in those terms of reference as well what defines them as experts, what our criteria will be for allowing them into the panel or selecting them to the panel, as well as the kinds of things that we'll be looking at to assign them a review to your project. But there will be 2 independent experts per project, and we did that, to make sure that there aren't any conflicting opinions that can't be resolved, etc. And so they're going to be looking at the appropriateness of your project activities that are targeting, conservation or restoration of biodiversity. Can they generate biodiversity outcomes? Are they appropriate for the ecosystem? So for example, I see Viraj in the room. So, you know, if a project was in a savanna and grassland landscape, but they were going to be intensively replanting trees for that particular ecosystem, that may not be the most appropriate type of activity. So those are the kinds of things that they'll be looking for in terms of making sure that your activities are suitable for the ecosystem and for the kind of outcomes that you're looking to produce. They're also going to be looking at your safeguard risks assessment around biodiversity and the mitigation measures that you're proposing. They will, of course, be reviewing the indicators, the condition indicators that you've selected and the reference values. Again, making sure that they're the right kinds of indicators, not just for your ecosystem, but also for your project activities, right? That you're choosing things that meet nature framework requirements, that are suitable for your project's ecosystem, and that are also going to be appropriate, you know, for your activities. So you're not, for example, measuring something that has nothing to do with your activities whatsoever, which of course we wouldn't want. That wouldn't be sound project design. They'll be looking in relationship to that at your sampling protocol for your indicators and your overall monitoring plan. Just making sure, for example, that the methods you're using for a given indicator, for example, is appropriate. And that we're going to be able to move forward to validation with confidence in the way in which you're going to be monitoring the indicators you've selected. And then finally, they'll be evaluating your crediting baseline. So the method that you've selected, did the documented inventory of available data and the use of the decision tree, did it steer you in the right direction? Did you choose the appropriate method? Was it implemented accordingly with the Nature Framework's requirements for that particular crediting baseline method? And then just checking your stepwise calculation all the way through, you know, the actual implementation and coming up with an estimated crediting baseline parameter. So I'm just going to pause there and see if anybody has any specific questions about, you know, the sort of project cycle steps at registration, leading up to validation. Do you have any questions about the technical expert panel? Anything at all? No. Okay, great. Well, certainly in the Q&A, if something pops up in your head a little bit later, yeah, by all means, we can revisit. So next and relatedly, we'll take a look at the new criteria that will be required for Nature Framework VVBs. And so we're starting with, of course, the SD Vista requirements that are applicable to VVBs. And they're pretty broad. So any VVB organization has to be accredited by a body either with the ISO or IEC 17011. And that is reflecting compliance for, for conformity assessment. So, you know, has that organization been accredited against criteria for assessing conformity with, you know, rules, requirements, etc. Does that organization, is it able to demonstrate sufficient competencies for auditing AFLU projects? Do they have operational policies in place for project level assessment? And do they have liability insurance of at least $5 million US? So those are the requirements as a starting point that the actual VVB has to be able to meet. And if a VVB is an existing VCS VVB, they've already been approved by Verra, that can be a starting point. And then it's just those additional criteria for SD Vista that they have to comply with. And then the approach that we've taken for the Nature Framework is really about making sure that the audit teams, the folks that are actually coming out, that are reviewing all your documentation, that will do a site visit, that they have the right skills and competencies, the right expertise to be able to effectively audit your project. Because we know that the Nature Framework's overall scope is very different than a lot of other project activities that get audited. It's very different than carbon. And it's very, very different even for those of you that are familiar with Verra's Climate, Community and Biodiversity standard, so the CCB. You know, we know that the Nature Framework, the bar is much higher, it's much more rigorous, and there's a lot more technical specificity. So we wanted to make sure that VVBs have teams with the right competencies, the right skills, experience, and knowledge to be able to audit your projects effectively. So these are the requirements that are published today. So each member of the audit team has to have at least a bachelor's degree, and depending on what element of the audit scope that particular team member is responsible for, they have to be educated in conservation biology, ecology, or another ecosystem-focused environmental science. And if they're auditing any of the elements that are focused on sustainable development in your nature framework project, they need to be educated in the social sciences with some relevance to sustainable development. Lead auditors need to have completed at least 8 AFLU audits, again, focused on conservation or restoration activities or involving those kinds of activities. And then other audit team members have to have completed at least 5 AFLU audits. So, again, we don't want any trainees coming out to audit projects. We want auditors and team members that are, really well capacitated and experienced to be able to effectively audit nature framework projects. Professional experience, which is not so different than what's in SD Vista. We just made it a bit more specific to have at least 3 years of professional experience working in roles that address ecosystem conservation, restoration, or sustainable development. And then, of course, sufficient competencies for the audit scope that that particular team member is assigned to. And we will also be assembling a training for VVBs for the nature framework specifically for all the reasons that I've just mentioned, right? Making sure that folks understand the nature framework's approach, that they understand the rules and requirements and, the scope of the audit. And again, trying to really ensure the best capacitated VVBs that we possibly can for moving forward into nature framework validation and verification. And so I think the other thing we wanted to talk about, and unfortunately, I think there's 1 or 2 people who are not here in the call, but in any case, we are recording this, and so I will share it, and again, with a follow-up email. I mentioned in our post-launch session that pilots will have the option to hold their own open call for nature framework VVBs. And this is, again, entirely optional. It's not an obligation. But what it would allow you to do is to add additional criteria, for example, in particular, potentially a budget scope or other context-specific elements. If your project is working very closely with Indigenous peoples, if there are other highly specific elements of your project activities, for example, if you're rewilding, large herbivores or things like that, that you would really want to make sure that somebody auditing that particular element has the right skills and experience. You can add additional criteria to the Nature Framework VVB's requirements that's being published today. And you can run your own open call. And what that would look like is, sharing the publication with the VVB's requirements, perhaps building out a terms of reference or however else you wanted to format it would be entirely up to you as an organization, adding your additional criteria. And then the suggestion would be that the VVBs could submit, summary documents to you for your own independent review. And then you would be able to do 2 things following from that. For the VVBs that you felt were well capacitated, maybe it was within your budget scope, they have the right, context-specific experience for your ecosystem or your particular geographic region, for example. So you could advise the VVBs that you think are the strongest. The number of them is up to you. It could be 1 or 2. It could be, 3 to 5. And request that they go ahead and submit their documentation to Verra, because of course Verra has an internal approval process that would have to be complied with. And then at the same time, you would also be able to advise Verra of your selection so that we are flagged in advance of which VVBs you've already interacted with that you feel are strong VVBs for your project context. Because of course, we will be reviewing quite closely the audit team's competencies in alignment with those requirements. And so if we know in advance that Earthacre says these 3 VVBs seem like great candidates for our particular project context, and we've already reviewed, and they're starting the approval process within Verra, it's just a flag for us so that we can look at them a bit more closely, because of course we may get dozens upon dozens of submissions from new VVBs, so it will be helpful for us to know which ones have been vetted to some degree by existing nature framework pilots. So I'll pause there as well and see if anybody has any questions related to VVBs, to the option to hold an open call, anything specific to that. Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
I
then
have one
let's.
question.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, just a question I make in case I mean there is a submission of the VVBs to Vera. How long does it take for Vera to go through that process of evaluating those VVBs? Generally, how long does it take?
I'm going to say it'll probably take about a month. And the application process will go through our auditing and accreditation team. But I've worked quite closely with them already, to develop those requirements, to talk about how that review process will go to approve new VVBs, etc. The one thing that also would have to be done is for brand new VVBs, if they're not existing, Vera approved VVBs, there is a process to open that registry account for the VVB, which is, sort of I think they call it a KYC, a know your customer. There's just some additional steps that have to be gone through on the registry side as well. And I was told that could take about 2-3 weeks. So I would say I've estimated that if VVBs could have their submissions in by, I would say early February, then that should give us enough time to review and approve. And especially, this is where if you vet potential VVBs first, and you run your own open call and you flag them, you can just, flag them to me, that's fine. But that's what will be very helpful for us. If we know the ones that pilot projects have already said, we like these VVBs, we can target or sort of segment our review and try to move through the approval process for those VVBs first. Because again, we're going to have this open call. We could get 100 new VVBs coming in, and so if we know that there's 25 of them that the pilots have already vetted through independent review, that's extremely helpful for us.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Sure. Okay, well, let's just move into general Q&A, and I have kept this slide. Oh, I see. Yes, I see somebody else's hand. Sorry, go ahead, Raj.
Oh, thank you so much. No, this is super helpful. Thank you for outlining all of this. My question is just understanding a little bit more around that requirement for the VVBs, because in our work, so we've come across a number of very competent, like high quality environmental orgs that have strong research capabilities, have been researching the landscape for up to 50 years in some cases, but they don't necessarily have that auditing experience. I'm wondering, is there scope to include, just like trying to think through as we build these markets together, like, and create greater capacity for VVBs, certainly, in a place like Kenya. I'm wondering, are there any, like, what would could I tell an organization that has a deep, like a lot of experience with the biodiversity of this landscape, but they don't quite have that auditing experience? Is there anything I can tell them?
I think that's a really good question. And I think I need to get some feedback from our auditing and accreditation team about that accreditation process. For example, with the ISO 17011 or with this ISEAL Alliance member, and really have a better understanding of how long or what that particular process looks like. Because I suspect that would probably be a little bit too time intensive, in the period from now until April, for example, to get themselves ISO accredited. Although I don't know that for sure. So that would be a first point of exploration, right? To say, well, look into accreditation processes and see how quickly you might be able to get accredited in that way. But then, of course, there is still the issue of having the auditing experience. And so I think the other thing that is viable is reaching out to existing auditing organizations, existing VVBs, and doing some networking there and seeing whether they might be able to come on board in some way, or have a collaborative approach and work towards becoming part of an audit team. Because I agree with you. I think that there does, and part of the reason we're doing it in this way is to try to straddle the fence and acknowledge that we do need folks who have explicit auditing experience. And we need to build out that pool, but that we also need to do it with the hope that we will have more VVBs in the global south, which is what we would very much like to see happen. So I think there is sort of an evolution there that we're hoping this will kick off. And I think it is going to come down to, you know, organizations that have deep experience in research, you know, focused on ecosystem conservation or restoration, you know, reaching out to existing auditing bodies and saying, how can we work together? How can we, you know, participate in audits with you, and that kind of thing. The other thing I would suggest, and this is something I'd have to check about making a direct connection, but the, let's see, GCBI, Botanical Gardens Conservation International. So it's the other way around. Botanical Gardens Conservation, BGCI. They launched at the COP the Global Biodiversity Standard, which is just for certification only. So it's not an asset generating standard or methodology like the Nature Framework is. But what they have done as part of related to the process of that is they're really focusing on what they call a train the trainers approach towards capacitating auditors explicitly in the global south. Folks exactly like the ones you're talking about, Viraj, who have been, you know, researchers in the past and trying to capacitate them for auditing. And so I can do a little bit of background research and reach out to that contact. All of this stuff, unfortunately, given the timing, I think we'll have to wait until January. But I don't see any reason why you wouldn't be able to look into that yourself. So again, Botanical Gardens Conservation International, and do a little bit of searching around their train the trainers approach for the Global Biodiversity Standard. And I think you'd be able to reach out to them directly and ask those same kinds of questions, you know, and say, okay, well, we're trying to contribute, you know, to building out a bigger pool of VVBs for Nature Framework or other biodiversity type projects, and, you know, see what resources they may be able to offer as well, or suggestions. Because they are targeting, you know, building capacity for auditing in the global south.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Alamgir, I see your hand up as well.
Yeah. I have this question that our project has been through validation and verification process, our carbon project. So we know some of those VVBs which are already registered with Verra under the VCS standard and CCB standard. So those will be eligible. I mean, the ones that have done our validation of carbon project under VCS and CCB standard, we can use those in case, I mean, like they registered themselves also under the SD Vista standard.
Yeah, they still have to apply to be an SD Vista approved VVB. So they do still need to resubmit the same application, but you'll see it looks different there. It asks for some different competencies, etc. for SD Vista. But yes, if they're already an approved VCS VVB, they just need to apply to be an SD Vista program VVB as well, which that should be more straightforward for existing VCS VVBs. But they will still need to have this supplementary application to demonstrate that their audit teams have the competencies for the Nature Framework requirements, because that's definitely going to be missing. I mean, I think any VVB that has audited, you know, just a VCS project, it's pretty unlikely that they have, you know, an entire audit team with the capacity or with the requirements that are there on the right side of that slide. And even for CCB, you know, the requirements for CCB, for the biodiversity element of CCB, are nowhere near as deep or as specific as the Nature Frameworks are. And so that's, again, why we added these additional requirements for the audit teams. But, you know, the intention behind launching this now is to try to give, you know, new VVBs an opportunity to submit their documentation and get approved by Verra, as well as give existing VVBs an opportunity to potentially fill gaps in their audit teams, if they know they don't have folks, you know, who are educated in conservation biology. You know, I've seen some of the CCB reviews, for example, and, you know, you tend to have folks who are just like broad environmental scientists, but most of their work has been focused on carbon. And these are the kinds of things that, you know, the market is asking us for. They are really wanting us to be addressing integrity, both as Verra, as project proponents, you know, all the actors in voluntary markets, to be focused on integrity at every step. And so this is, you know, our effort to focus on integrity and auditing as well. And just to make sure, you know, that it's not necessarily about tightening the auditing scope or, you know, making it more rigorous than it already is, but making sure that it's appropriate. You know, and the other part of that is if you have auditors come out who don't know what they're looking at, and then, you know, raising findings on your project design that aren't accurate from an ecosystem perspective or from you know, an ecology perspective, then that's problematic for you as a project proponent as well. So, you know, we'll see how this evolves in the first quarter. And certainly my hope is, yes, that we will, you know, see an expanded pool of VBBs that have the right competencies, and preferably more of them from the Global South. And, you know, the point that I made in the post-launch webinar, and that I want to reinforce now about holding your own open call, has a lot to do with the budget, because, you know, we all know that you're making investments in, you know, developing a nature framework project, and none of us know yet what a biodiversity credit is going to be valued at. So there is some uncertainty around, you know, your return on that investment, and the risk that you're taking. And so I would encourage you, again, if it's within your organization's capacity, you know, to run your own open call and to include a budget scope in it. That is very much to your advantage. And I really emphasized this internally, you know, as something we wanted to allow project proponents, you know, pilot projects explicitly to do, so that, you know, there's an option to not just lean on existing VCS VBBs, but, you know, perhaps those that might be a little bit more affordable, especially for those projects that are just NGOs, you know, that don't have existing carbon credit finance. You know, it's something that we wanted to acknowledge, and try to help all of you address as best we can, while still, you know, remaining independent as a standard setting body.
Thank you.
Sure. All right, so let's move into some Q&A. And I, as I started to say, I just kept this slide very basic. And, you know, I pulled this out of the questions that were shared in the survey, but most of you just shared sort of very, very broad or very basic suggestions or themes. So there were not very many scenarios that had a very specific question attached to it. So I've just grouped them in you know, thematic fashion. And I'm just going to open it. So if you shared a specific question or a theme, if you have a specific question or theme, we'll just go through them by topic. And I've also ordered them in such a way that I think MRV and crediting baselines are relevant for everybody. The grouped projects and, you know, stakeholder engagement for stacked projects are not relevant to everybody. And then we can talk at the very end about, you know, how pilots might be able to approach, you know, attracting funding and attention for buyers in this phase before you are, you know, a validated nature framework project. So I'll just start there. Anybody with specific questions around MRV? So your indicator selection, setting reference values, or sampling protocols. The more specific you can be, the better I can try to help you. David.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think mine is quite simple. Because I was just asking maybe your other projects, because it's a question that I've been asked by our partners, and their skepticism, if I may say so, in actually getting to this nature framework is the fact that what happens in the event that an external event, for instance, a drought, or a disease, perhaps if you are measuring species, affects your indicators, especially when you're talking about compositional indicators. Like, how can projects address that risk? I don't know if you're getting my question.
Yes, definitely. And it's something that we absolutely gave quite a lot of thought to. And I was just talking to Sinclair about this yesterday, as a matter of fact, because an approach that we took in the nature framework to try to counter that risk is going to be a learning point for us. So there are a few things I would say to that. We know that, you know, stochastic events, external events may influence the biodiversity outcomes on a regular basis or a periodic basis. We don't know yet how to account, for example, for, you know, the influence of climate change in your biodiversity outcomes. But what we have encouraged projects to do is to monitor as frequently as you're able. And we considered this mostly in the way that we approached how a project quantifies the outcomes at the end of the monitoring period. And it's going to look a bit different for conservation projects or projects that are mostly conservation, where, you know, they're primarily trying to hold the existing ecosystem condition, you know, in one place, versus projects that are restoration, where the intention, you know, is obviously to have gains year on year. But what we've encouraged projects to do, although it's not a requirement, is, you know, to monitor as frequently as you can, monitor annually if possible, for exactly that reason. And there is an aggregation, and now I'm going to have to find it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here for a minute so that I can actually try to find it while I'm talking. Because it's in the Nature Framework. There's an aggregation approach for how you combine your panels of monitoring data. Hold on, give me one second here. And the reason that we required projects to aggregate all of their individual panels of monitoring data, instead of just saying, here's where we started, here's where we ended, is exactly that point. That if it happens that in that last panel of monitoring data before the end of your monitoring period, if that happens to be the year that there is a terrible drought or a climate event, you know, that is external to the project's control, then you may not accurately represent the gains that you actually achieved over the course of that entire monitoring period. And so instead what we did is we said the projects need to aggregate all of their panels of monitoring data and use that to be able to quantify, because it will smooth out some of the stochastic nature or the risk of getting to year 4, for example, and that happens to be the year that there is a terrible drought or, you know, a storm or something along those lines that completely wipes out your gains. And if that's the only panel of monitoring data that you have, then I acknowledge that there's quite a risk to that. Okay, give me 1 second. I'm literally just trying to look in here and see exactly where it is. Okay, so it's step 9. So in section 7.6 in the quantification section, project biodiversity impacts, which is step 9. So monitoring your project impacts over the monitoring period. And the individual requirement is 7.6.4, that the project should be aggregating and averaging your outcomes based on your individual panels of monitoring data, rather than doing it in the way that I described, where you just use the last panel of monitoring data. So that will help to some degree, David, to alleviate a bit of that risk. But it really is, the outcome is going to depend on the project type. And this is feedback I would love to have from those of you whose projects are all or primarily restoration, and think about how this is going to play out in that scenario, because this is what we were discussing yesterday, whether or not that particular approach could bring down some of the gains for restoration only projects. And this, I think, is really going to be a valid learning point for us, and it may be something that we need to add another quantification approach for restoration projects, not a separate quantification, but another aggregation approach for restoration projects. But we also have to think about how to handle that for projects that are combined activity types. So it's a little bit tricky, but I would just flag that for you as one sort of a risk mitigation approach built into the overall quantification requirements, and 2, as something that restoration only projects should look at carefully and then come to me with feedback, you know, as we move forward to registration, or even just in the course of, you know, your first few years of monitoring.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll review that section and inquire in case we need anything additional.
Great. Preeti.
Hi, thank you, Amy, for the long introduction. I have a few questions, but I want to first focus on one thing. So when we make the estimation of nature credits, let's say for a period of 5 years, we assume we get 40,000 credits. So is it in carbon terms, you would assume, okay, and if you get 40,000 credits at the end of 4 years, per year you get around 8,000 credits or so. Is it safe to assume the same for nature credits as well? That if we were to sell, for example, if we were to sell something upfront in terms of nature credits, and we make an estimate that this is our estimated impact in 5 years, would we be able to split it over these years as well? Or is it only a value that you get at the end of the project and that's all you can sell? So how is this visualized?
Well, I'll just remind you that your nature credit issuances, will be based on a monitoring period, right? And so I understand that you'll obviously have to project that across the entire project crediting period, but obviously being reminded that that it will be per monitoring period. And I think this is something that, we're also open to your feedback about how you might approach this, because I just had this conversation with another pilot the other day as well, asking that very same question. Well, if we annualize it, in order to attract investment, how is that actually going to work? Because particularly for projects that are more conservation, it's probably going to be more of a flat issuance year on year, because obviously, those projects are not going to see the same kind of gains that a restoration project will. But I think what would be a good approach? What would be a bad approach in your view? Like what would you prefer and what would be problematic? And I can
think
take that on board.
what we would prefer would be that if we present this project to an external person, we would like to show at least for a certain amount of time, let's say 50% of the project period, 20 years, that we can project a certain estimation of how we see the biodiversity to improve, and then annualize these benefits. Of course, we are always using modeled versus actuals approach on this, but it would be more beneficial for a client to know that every year this is the improvement that they can probably see or they probably contribute to. So that is an ideal approach. But we already know that it's only issued on a 5-year basis, and that's completely all right. But it's nice to visualize it on an annual basis so we can report on it every year. So that is an ideal scenario.
I on the surface of it, I don't see anything wrong with that. I think you would certainly want to make sure that the way that it's presented is very clearly articulated, not just that it's modeled, but how much uncertainty is actually in that model. And, I think the factor that then is essential to communicate there as well is that the crediting baseline needs to have that adjustment, right? And so I think if you communicate the elements that could introduce some change in those estimated outcomes, and the other stochastic elements like, climate change events or things like that we can't control. And then you also just, reflect on the relevant requirements in the nature framework that have to be complied with. I don't see a problem with that, because in that regard, it's not so different from the way in which, carbon works. And
exactly.
And so, I think that really just comes down to communicating completely and making sure that, all of those factors that are going to influence what the figures might look like are very clearly communicated to investors. And you try to quantify as much as possible the uncertainty that's there in your modeling.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think then that one is clear. And next is a very short question. So you mentioned something about sampling protocols and designs. So I was just wondering, because a lot of projects have already implemented some of the monitoring with a certain sampling design. If there is a requirement that we have to improve it, that's always possible, but we cannot change what is already done. So is there room for this with the technical expert panel and the VVVs? To still submit the monitoring data that we collected with a certain sampling design or protocol, and then improve on it on the next iteration.
I think that's a really good question, and I think that we probably need to find a way to accommodate that for projects that well, I suppose to some degree for all projects, right? Because every project is going to have to come with a starting condition baseline, you know, with those measurements, and so I will give some thought to that. I'll have to take that back to the team. But yeah, I think it's something. I mean, you know, the technical expert panel review is brand new. This is, you know, this is something we don't have in place. And so, you know, we're defining the scope of their review. We're defining how that's going to be communicated back and forth. And I think that element of, you know, how to lean on, for example, the Nature Framework's adaptive management requirement, which is exactly that, right? And so if this is the way in which, you know, starting condition data was captured, this is the feedback for monitoring going forward. You know, I think unless the only scenario I would see where we might not be able to do that is, and I think this probably does not apply to any of the pilots, but as new projects come in, I mean, if it's very obvious that the starting condition data was collected terribly, you know, right? If things are highly inappropriate, you know, the sampling protocol was very weak, the methods that were used were not appropriate. I mean, the kinds of things that if you've already consulted with an ecologist or, you know, another ecosystem expert at the very beginning to feed into your sampling design, that shouldn't ever happen. But that's the kind of thing that it's designed to protect against. But I think that's a good point. So we need to just consider starting condition, data collection, and sampling as a TEP review point. Okay.
Yeah.
That's a great point. Thanks, Pooji.
Yeah. If nobody else has a question, I have one more, but okay, I can just go.
Go for it.
So I saw the worked examples, and we created an internal template that can be used for these estimations as well. But what I was missing was how the conclusion of the crediting baseline was made for some of the projects. And I was wondering, because there's a clear differentiation within, let's say, the framework when you talk about restoration and conservation. Where in conservation, you go for no reduction, like no change scenario. And in restoration, you look at an improvement scenario. But a lot of the projects have a combination of both. So how would this reflect on the crediting baseline? Because I see that both the examples have both these, let's say, elements in it, but it was difficult to understand how they came to that number. So I was wondering if you have any information on that, which will be useful for me to develop my own internal template.
Well, we didn't, the figures, the baseline parameters that are in there are essentially dummy baseline parameters. I mean, you'll see that it's the same baseline parameter for both worked examples, right?
Yeah.
And that was just, honestly, just came down to the reality that we were working with the biodiversity consultancy to finish building out those 3 methods at the same time, you know, that we were assembling all the rest of the pieces of the nature framework in the last few weeks. So there wasn't an opportunity for us, you know, to actually go through that entire process for those explicit worked examples, which is why we just used the same dummy figure for both of them. Also, that was just easing as a point of comparison, right? But I think I wouldn't see, and I'm open to anybody else's feedback on this, but I wouldn't see that a combined activity type would necessarily imply any difference in the crediting baseline, because ultimately your choice of crediting baseline is guided by the available data in relationship to your selected condition indicators. It's not directly related to your actual project activities. It should, as we remember, the indicators that you use in your crediting baseline, regardless of the method, I mean, they need to be reflective of, you know, the drivers of biodiversity loss, right, that are relevant for your project, but that's relevant to your ecosystem. That's not necessarily relevant to your project activities per se. So I wouldn't envision that would be different for combined activity type versus one or the other.
Okay. Would it be good if I can share with you later just the overview of our own estimations? We also have quite a few dummy numbers in it, but it's nice to have your opinion on whether we are on the right way of this estimation.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things, and we'll talk about it in terms of next steps into what one-to-one support will look like, you know, for all of the projects in the new year, and so that would be a good opportunity for us to take a look at that together then.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah,
Let
that's
me.
all from my side.
Sure. All right, let me go back, share my screen, and remember what other topics we have here. Okay, so anything else to do with reference values? Let's see, I seem to remember, Lee, did you have a specific question about reference values? Lee or Mark? I mean, anybody else, anything else to do with reference values?
Like over 30% off, like we could get, or
No, I think that we've huddled up a couple of times and we've got an email coming back to you on that, Amy. So I'll just table that for right now.
Okay, great.
We're just working through the process, and this is very valuable information that is being shared and relevant to what we're doing. But we've got to figure out that successional growth, and I think we've got a solution. So coming back to you shortly on that.
Great. All right, well, there were a couple of queries related to crediting baselines. And I think there's one or two people who shared some queries that aren't here. And so I suppose we'll just have to kind of leave that open-ended. One of the questions had to do with whether or not there's intended to be the same rate of biodiversity change across all three of the crediting baselines methods. And I think that's frankly kind of an impossible question to answer at this stage. Because the volume of modeling that we would have to do, you know, for all different kinds of project, all different kinds of ecosystems and given data sets and whatnot is just certainly beyond the scope of what was possible leading up to the framework's launch. But, you know, I think as all of you conduct your inventories for available data, you know, after you've selected your condition indicators or in conjunction with selecting your condition indicators, and you really start to digest what's possible in those methods, you know, we can get into that in the new year as well, in one-to-one support calls, because there's just going to be so much specificity for each of you. There was a question, again, very broad, about grouped projects. I'm just going to open things up now because, you know, we're at the top of the hour. I mean, we still have plenty of time. But before I talk about attracting funding and buyers, and that question number 4 there is something more specific that I believe Pontera asked. But I'm just going to open things now for any kind of general questions, specific questions. We're gonna have open Q&A. Otherwise, I'll answer these last few in a more targeted fashion, and then we'll be moving on to next steps. Okay. Then I don't think anybody here in the room right now is taking a grouped project approach, if I remember correctly. Well, no, I suppose Pontera maybe in the future. Viraj, I see you coming off mute. Is that a question that your team submitted?
Yeah, we'd be definitely interested to learn more about how you think about group projects. Yep.
Do you have a more specific question around that? Because I mean, the nature framework enables a grouped project approach. You know, there are very specific requirements throughout the framework for how different elements of grouped projects need to be addressed. Do you have anything specific that you wanted to know about that?
Yeah, so I think the way that we're thinking about it is we have a specific region within, you know, so we're looking at sort of southern Kenya as a broader region, but we've got an initial pilot, like instance 1 is going to be a specific area, a specific project site. And we're viewing, you know, internally, we're like, okay, let's just see how this works. But, you know, with the goal of potentially expanding the project as we open up wildlife corridors, things like that. So for future instances. And I just wanted to make sure we're thinking about this in the right way.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing to do is just to go back in the framework and, do a Control F search for everything
Yeah.
that reflects on group projects and make sure that you understand. I mean, generally speaking, the framework, in many ways mirrors the VCS, for example, about, one, stating that you're going to take a grouped project approach at the outset, identifying the criteria, the selection criteria or inclusion criteria that you would apply for proposing additional instances in the future. And it's the kinds of things you would expect. I mean, it needs to be within the project boundary. It needs to be subject to the same pressures, similar activities, similar monitoring, et cetera, et cetera. I think the thing, probably to home in on are the things that would need to be different, right? Whether or not, if it was a different ecosystem context, would you need to select different condition indicators and select different reference values? Think about what's different in new instances and whether or not you would need to address that difference in some way, or if that difference would, be problematic for adding new instances under the nature framework requirements. And then if you have, specific questions about that, that you want to share when we do one-to-ones in the new year, then we can unpack that a little bit further.
Great, thank you.
Sure thing. Anybody else? Anything with grouped projects? David, I saw your hand go up, but did that answer maybe just sort of address your question?
Yes, it did. Yes, it did. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. And so then I believe Jill had asked the question about stakeholder engagement for stacked projects, but this of course would be relevant for a couple of other projects as well. I think the thing to remember here is that it's not necessarily possible to just piggyback directly and sort of copy paste your existing stakeholder engagement over from your VCS project. And this goes back to the fact that in the nature framework we did raise the bar excuse me on safeguards across the board, and that includes the approach to stakeholder engagement. Plus, the approach to stakeholder engagement, in the nature framework under SD Vista differs a bit from the VCS. But the reason why we opted to use the nature framework for that higher bar of stakeholder engagement and safeguards, again, goes back to integrity issues. The ICVCM, so the Integrity Council focused on the voluntary carbon market, has developed these core carbon principles focused on integrity. Very many of you may be, quite familiar with them at this point because they've been so visible. And we took the opportunity to integrate the kinds of safeguards and stakeholder engagement requirements in the nature framework that we know we're going to see in the VCS as well. But of course, making changes to, Verra's carbon standard is like steering a cruise ship. It's a much bigger piece of work. And so we took this sort of opportunistic moment to say, okay, well, let's put these safeguards in the nature framework because we know that that is what the market is demanding, and we know that that's the expectation for the VCS as well, and and test them basically. So I would just say, look closely at those stakeholder engagement requirements, look closely at the social and environmental safeguards, acknowledge where they differ from your VCS project requirements. And the way in which you've approached those things in your VCS project design. And also just be mindful that, things like the benefit sharing mechanism, that has to be agreed for the nature framework. It's not enough just to simply say, well, we've got it in place for the VCS project, and so we're going to use that same thing. There still needs to be a participatory process of agreement. And also I would flag that there are more rigorous requirements around that, around the kind of information that you share with stakeholders to facilitate that agreement, and what can and cannot be included. So for example, I think the thing that stands out for me is, your benefits sharing mechanism cannot be exclusively, sort of in-kind benefits that are directly related to your activities. So for example, if your project is planting trees as one of your activities, and the only element of your benefits sharing is you're going to give those stakeholders those trees, there is no other element of benefits sharing, that it will not comply with nature framework requirements. So I really do encourage you, look into those things closely, and think about that element of your project design. especially those of you who want to register sooner rather than later so that you can start those stakeholder engagement processes now. Alamgir, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I have two questions. One related to this stakeholder engagement and benefit sharing, and the other is totally off this, but I think that's important. I will ask that later. First, let me ask the first question, which is about we are implementing a project which is on state-owned lands, and there the communities have no rights to whatsoever to the benefits as per the legal requirements. But I mean, like it's optional. It's optional. I mean, like whether so. I mean, like in that case, and since we are implementing this project with the government of Sindh, and they own the land, so I mean, like it's a bit tricky as per law. The local communities do not have any entitlement to the say biodiversity credits that will be generated under the project. But I mean, somehow we got to do lobbying with the government that if the standard requires that the communities are to be given share from the revenue that is generated from the sale of nature credits. So I mean, like so it's a binding from the standard that we got to make them shareholder in the benefits that are deriving from the nature credits revenue.
Well, what the nature framework asks you to do under SD Vista is to identify stakeholders and to categorize them based on the level of impact that they may experience as a result of project activities. And so I think that would be a starting point for you, would be to go into those requirements and really look at how those local communities, how they would be categorized, you know, as highly impacted, not impacted at all, only, you know, interested stakeholders, for example. And whilst, you know, you may not have a legal obligation based on that land ownership element towards certain local community stakeholders. However, if they would be categorized as highly impacted by your project activities, then they would need to be addressed in benefits sharing. So I would just encourage you to look closely at those requirements. And you know, we're working on the project description template as well, which I know I've been promising you guys for a couple of weeks now. And what I want to do, and it'll only happen before the end of the year. I'll probably be able to send you something that you can look at, you know, after the holidays. But you'll be able to see a little bit more how the sustainable development context and sort of establishing the without project scenario in the sustainable development context relates to how you identify and classify or categorize stakeholders. And then, you know, that has some influence, of course, on your stakeholder engagement, as well as how you conduct your safeguards risk assessment. And so some of this, I think, will be a little bit better understood when you can see the template. But I do really encourage you, you know, go into the requirements themselves, read those sections very closely, and think about how the stakeholder identification and categorization process applies to your project context, and how those stakeholders that are local community members, you know, but they may not be legal rights holders, but if they're impacted by your project, whether they're participating in activities, whether they're being asked to shift their activities somewhere else or change behavior, if there's some dependency on them for compliance, you know, with some behavior change. I mean, there's all kinds of ways in which they could be impacted by the project. And I think that's the defining factor under the nature framework for whether or not you might need to include them in stakeholder engagement around benefits sharing.
Okay, thanks. My second question is like not exactly like related to this, but I think it's important. Like in the carbon markets, there are two types of carbon credits. There are two types of markets: the compliance markets and the voluntary markets. The compliance markets arise because of the Paris Agreement. Because of the Paris Agreement, because it asks the countries to submit the NDCs, and then there are obligations, legal obligations on companies to reduce their carbon footprint. Could the biodiversity CAP also kind of emphasize on governments to make it legally binding about having legal obligations with respect to biodiversity conservation, so there are compliance markets created also in nature credits, because right now I think it's just only voluntary market that is existing.
Yes, that's a great point. I mean, we would certainly love to see that happen in the longer run. And I think there are some governments that have different types of compliance markets. For example, I'm thinking of compliance with habitat banking in Colombia. That's, I think, a very prime example. And then we have to think about how, if a project is obligated to conserve a parcel of land through legal compliance based on, an environmental impact assessment or something like that, how would that project meet regulatory surplus under the nature framework? So then that becomes a little bit more of a question. But I mean, the short answer to your question is yes, we would love to see those kinds of things emerge. And I think, our regional engagement team would like to have those kinds of conversations with governments as well. And I think if there are government stakeholders that are willing to have those kinds of conversations, and you are in a position to make those introductions, please let us know, and we can certainly connect Verra's regional engagement team to those stakeholders and initiate those conversations. Okay, so Jill, I see your hand up as well.
Hi, excuse me. Thanks, Amy, for this conversation. Relative to stakeholder engagement, what we've done on our project, which, as you know, is a group restoration project in Panama, is that from the beginning, we've talked to our private landowners about carbon credits and nature credits, and made clear in the benefit sharing agreement that they have access to any nature capital related revenue that's produced through the use of their land. So we've talked to them about a nature credit at sort of a high level. If I'm being honest, I don't think they've really focused on it in part of our conversations because it's a bit more ephemeral to them even than carbon credits are. And it's not the same in that we don't have a pre-finance arrangement where we can talk to them about the pricing, like what it's actually worth, just because we're not there yet. And so I'm curious sort of whether that counts, how it counts, to your point on the bar that's set. I think we're applying the VCS 47 bar on stakeholder engagement to all the things that we do with this kind of nature capital context to it. But I'm just trying to figure out how much more do we need to do, and does any of our historical work, does it count in the context that I provided?
And I think, let me go back into the framework itself and we can take a look. I think some of it will count without knowing exactly what was communicated and what was documented. It sounds like some degree of communication around that would count towards nature framework requirements compliance. Certainly, for a defined nature framework project, that would need to be communicated more explicitly. And then whatever that benefits sharing agreement looks like for nature credit finance, that certainly would need to be participatory stakeholder engagement around defining what that benefit sharing mechanism, what it's comprised of, what is the actual benefits that are being shared, that kind of thing. And that needs to be developed fully, and specifically for the nature framework project. So it sounds as if you've, had sort of general conversations introducing the concept of nature credit finance. But it wouldn't have been in the context of, I presume anyway, of a nature framework project that is now going to be registered under the nature framework. And so, yeah, that would be another layer of stakeholder engagement that you would need to initiate.
Okay. Yeah, I think just being transparent, I think what we're going to have in our case is a timing issue where the biodiversity monitoring work that we've done, the data gathering will precede an explicit conversation like that. And so I think we'll just have to figure out how to weave those things together, because it's fairly easy for us to go back to our landowners and provide this kind of briefing that we're talking about, grounded in these other conversations. But the data gathering's already been ongoing, right? And so I think we just need to be able to knit that together.
Well, and
Thank you.
I can check on that within the team as well, because we've talked about this or touched on it at least a few times. Whether the stakeholder engagement needs to be, the benefit sharing mechanism in particular needs to be fully defined by the time the project is registered and validated. Yeah, I can give some thought and have some discussion internally around the timeline of those things, and how closely they need to be aligned with one another, or in terms of, you know, setting a historical start date from when you had your first complete panel of condition monitoring data, in relationship to when you would have completed, you know, the full stakeholder engagement per the nature framework requirements and define a nature framework benefit sharing mechanism, because that's what I'm hearing you say is perhaps misaligned right now, right?
Yes, exactly. And then that'd be very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, sure thing. Okay, folks, any other closing questions? Last chance. Otherwise, we can talk about some next steps. Just make sure I'm going back to sharing the screen. Okay, well, in that case, let's indeed do that. So, flagging a couple of things for you. The most relevant, perhaps, is the fact that I am going on paid leave. I'm taking holiday. Much needed, because I haven't had any holiday at all this year. So I am going to be out from the 24th of December next week until the 24th of January. And so, you know, in that intervening period, I will really request that you please, you know, use Discourse for question and answer, for question at least until I get back, and answer when I return. But whilst I'm out of the office, rather than sending emails, and again, so many of these questions that you're asking now, and questions that I've gotten from individual pilots over the last few weeks, are absolutely questions that, you know, your colleagues and fellow project proponents are going to benefit from. So please do post them. You know, when I get back, responding to those questions in Discourse will be one of my top priority tasks. If there's anything urgent or emergent, like really critical for some reason, there is going to be a colleague in place to respond, but really, you know, only very urgent things. And she's only coming back from the 10th of January. So in that regard, if you're able to wait, you know, just another few weeks, that's much appreciated. Again, as a reminder, if you want to hold that open call for Nature Framework VVBs, you know, doing that in January. And as I mentioned in response to Alamgir's question, you know, your selected VVBs should aim to submit their documentation to Verra in early February, ideally, so that there's enough time to get them approved internally before, you know, your project is going to be undergoing validation. There was one question which we didn't directly address, because I think the person who posed it was perhaps not in the call today. But there was a query about attracting buyers, attracting, you know, potential funding, that sort of thing. And so I will just offer that friendly reminder that in our last community of practice session, I shared some specific prompts, things that you can respond to either in a recorded video, or if you feel more comfortable, just drafting quotes. But the intention will be to work with Verra's internal communications team in the first quarter and to do some profiling of projects. And we don't have a defined strategy in place for that just yet. But that is also going to be completely dependent on, you know, the material that you share with us. And so when I send out an email, I will make reference to that and remind you of, you know, what those questions are for prompts, where you can find that information. But that's something certainly you could be doing, you know, after everybody returns from holidays in January, so that those materials are ready, and we can perhaps, you know, start profiling pilot projects as future Nature Framework projects as soon as possible. And hopefully that would be something to attract, you know, potential funding or buyers. And then, of course, refining your project design as much as possible over the next few months. And the intention will be to start scheduling more targeted one-to-one support with each of your projects in February and March. I would love to be able to have, you know, 2 calls with each of you as best as possible within that time frame leading up to, you know, April 1st, because again, that's when I have to step away from, you know, from consulting, from adding the kind of more substantial feedback that I've been able to add or contribute as leading the piloting process, and then I have to step back and become, you know, a Vera standards administrator and project reviewer. And so then it really comes down to helping you interpret technical requirements, but not perhaps being able to offer you the kind of feedback that I've been able to, you know, over the last year or so. So I would say that the best thing that you can do in preparing for those one-to-one calls is really, you know, having very targeted, specific questions. So things that are really sticky for you, issues that are problematic, certainly share them in discourse first. You know, and then the things that are too project specific or that may be confidential, you know, hang on to those, and we can start scheduling one-to-ones as soon as I get back. And I will be doing that with some prioritization for the projects that intend to register sooner rather than later. It doesn't mean that projects who will register later won't get support. They certainly will, but it does mean that projects that are really intending to finalize their project design for April, for example, you know, of course, we would want to give them the support that they need sooner. And so those are things just to keep in mind over the next month or so. And with that, I will wrap things up and thank you for your time and for all of your efforts over the course of this year. And I look forward to seeing all of you in 2025. Best wishes to all. I hope you all have a happy, healthy new year.
Thank you. Happy New Year to all of you. And thanks, Amy.
Thank you,
for all
Amy.
Thanks very
support that
much,
you have been
Alamgir.
doing. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Amy.
Cheers all.